All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's BHCOE Business Development Series. I can see a couple of folks trickling in, so welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us for today's webinar about effectively training parents in behavior analytic interventions. My name is Sarah Lippak, and I am the CEO here at the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and I'll be the host of today's webinar. For those of you who haven't attended one of our monthly webinars, welcome. And for those of you who have attended, welcome back. We're always happy to see that these webinars have been a useful resource for all of you and are widely attended. Christine Ratcliffe is the one who curates the topics that are being discussed in these monthly webinars. So she's going to be putting her contact info in the chat for those of you who have suggestions or who are interested in sharing additional topic ideas. These are really created for you, and if you have any suggestions about what you'd like us to be talking about in these in the future, definitely don't hesitate to let us know. The goal of the series is really to help you as a business owner, as a director, as a supervisor, or as a clinician, access relevant information that can help run your ABA business more effectively, more efficiently, and with an eye for ensuring continuous improvement. So today's webinar topic is a very timely one because parent training, or collaboration as I like to call it, is one of the most widely missed areas in the accreditation evaluation. So oftentimes when we're doing our assessments, this is the area that a lot of providers tend to miss, not because of intent, but oftentimes because they just don't have the information available about what constitutes a quality parent training or collaboration program. And we know that research shows that when parents receive training, their children make longer gains than children whose parents weren't involved in the treatment program. So this really is such an important part of the clinical model that we are part of. So just a bit of context for those of you who aren't familiar with BHCOE accreditation yet. We are the only accrediting body that's specific to ABA organizations. And accreditation is an important oversight component that allows organizations to be held accountable to a set of standards in addition to what the individual practitioner is held to at the BACB. So it provides not only those standards to hold organizations to, but it also provides standardized peer review processes for organizations that allows them to benchmark their progress on things like patient outcome, turnover, staff satisfaction, and patient satisfaction. We take a lot of pride in the work we do, and I, with our board, subject matter experts, and auditors, work really hard to create a code that helps organizations positively impact their consumers. It's important to know our organization was created for behavior analysts and by behavior analysts to ensure that any regulation that's imposed upon our field comes from within our field and that we stay unified in what it means to provide quality services. So if you're interested in learning more about our accreditation process, feel free to reach out to me or one of our outreach coordinators whose contact I'll put in the chat box as well. Or you can always fill out a submission form on our website and someone will contact you. So as you're getting settled in, it looks like we still have a couple of folks joining here and there. So just a few other things to get started on before our presentation. It's important that you listen to this part because we always get questions about it. So I want to make sure you don't miss it. The webinar will be recorded for any of you watching at home, not on the live version. Unfortunately, CEUs are not available if you're not here for the live version. But for anyone who's registered for the webinar, you will be getting a recorded via email as well. Another thing to note is that if you've registered for the webinar, it does integrate into our mailing list. So you'll be updated on any upcoming webinars that are going in. If you don't want any more information, just hit the unsubscribe button. We won't take it personally. But it's a great way to keep an eye out from exciting topics coming up in the future, announcements and things like that. One of the most recent announcements that we put out into our newsletter is the Autism Investor Summit that we just opened registration for. It's not affiliated with BHCOE. It's just an event that's going to talk about what investment opportunities means for the ABA industry, and it's something that I'll link in the chat box as well for those of you interested. All right, I think we're ready to get started, and I hope everyone has their lattes or their lunches as we begin the webinar. Megan is a PhD BCBAD and is the co-founder of Navigation Behavioral Consulting and CEO of Peak ABA Solutions. She graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in psychology from John Carroll University in 2004 and obtained a master's in psychology with a specialization in ABA from Florida State University in 2007. She also earned her PhD in special education and behavior analysis at the Ohio State University in 2015. Dr. Miller's early training in behavior analysis occurred at the Cleveland Clinic Center for Autism in 2003. And since that time, she's provided services to over 100 children diagnosed with autism and other disabilities. She has taught courses in behavior analysis and special education at the University of Mary Washington, West Florida, Ohio State, Florida State, the list goes on, Southern Illinois University, and she's co-authored a number of journal articles published in the Journal of Developmental Physical Disability, Behavior Analysis and Practice, and Teaching Exceptional Children. She also is the co-author of the 7 Steps to Earning Instructional Control with Robert Schramm. And she's provided over 40 presentations to numerous professional organizations, including ABAI, FABA, ABAI, the Ohio Association for Behavior Analysis, and Emerald Coast Association for Behavior Analysis. She's a fantastic resource for our community and the perfect person to talk to us about parent training. I met her recently where we were both co-presenting, and she is just a wealth of knowledge. So with that being said, Megan, I'm gonna hand over the controls to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, BHCOE, for hosting this wonderful topic. As you mentioned, parent training. It's a topic that I typically have to do a lot of work with my supervisees and people that I'm mentoring because it just isn't really covered as well as I would like to see in our training program. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to share with everyone on the webinar today some of the things we've learned about parent training over time with the work we've been doing with in-home ABA intervention. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you all have questions as we go through, please feel free to type them in the chat box and I will try to answer them as we go. Sarah, if I miss any questions, feel free to chime in and let me know so that I can tell everyone the answer. So just a little bit about me. I know Sarah gave the background information. When I first started in the field, I worked at Florida State University as the clinical coordinator for autism services there. And we had a really big focus on parent training because that program in particular, we had scholarships where families could receive ABA intervention at a pretty, well, for free, but we only could do a few hours per week. So we really had to prioritize the time we had with each of the families and make sure that we were providing intervention, but also training the parents so that they could carry over what was being done when we weren't there. And that gave me a lot of opportunity because I didn't own the business or anything like that to spend time creating policies and procedures relating to parent training. And then when I moved to Virginia to start my own business, Navigation Behavioral Consulting, I, from the very beginning, laid out as part of our policies and procedures, parent training requirements. And over the years, we've just continued to refine and add to those requirements. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So basically just an example for all of you of one way as a business that you could try to incorporate more systematic procedures relating to parent training. So I don't have specific references in this presentation because it's only an hour relating to parent training research or parent training resources and things like that. This is more of an example of policies and procedures. But if you have questions about those types of things, feel free to connect with me after the webinar and I can send you some resources. So this is the overview of what we're going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to go over the parent training procedure that we have in place, share with you with a screen share some support documents that we've developed to assist us in providing parent training and documenting what we're doing, and then close with just a few guidelines that we've put into place for parent interactions. So as I mentioned before showing you this slide, at Navigation, we've had parent training procedures in place since we've started, but we constantly are refining those procedures. And I highly recommend for anyone that's working for a business, if you're in a leadership position or if you own a business, if you don't have things set down on paper relating to parent training and parent policies, that you take the time to sit down and do that. Because that's the biggest thing that's been helpful for us as we've developed our parent training procedures. Even with having everything in writing and going over it regularly with our clinicians and our families, drift still happens. And we also have to revise what we have in place pretty often as well. So having it down on paper at least gives everyone those expectations from the beginning. As soon as a family starts with us, as soon as an employee starts with us, we make it clear these are our expectations relating to parent training. And then we try to do the best we can to enforce those during the time that we're providing intervention with each family. So the learning objectives for today, just as a reminder, the participants will be able to explain recommended guidelines for parent training based on BHCOE and BACB codes. Participants will be able to explain at least 3 recommendations for parent training and coaching based on BHCOE and BACB codes. And participants will be able to apply at least 1 strategy for collaborating with parents based on BHCOE and BACB codes. So first, let's talk about the parent training procedures. So we have procedures in place for choosing parent training goals. This is something that we added a few years ago. It wasn't something that I had initially put into our parent training policies and procedures, but we've come to find is probably the key component to our parent training procedures. Without this, we were finding that there were 2 things happening. One, the employees that we were hiring that weren't with us from the beginning maybe hadn't received training on this before. So when we said 2 hours per month of parent training are required at minimum, they didn't really have any idea what that meant or what that should look like. So we had to put something down on paper to help guide our employees. But also we were experiencing that some of the families that we were trying to incorporate and do parent training with, they weren't really clear on what we were trying to do either. So having this down on paper, we go over it with both the employees and the families to make sure everyone's on the same page about this process just of training goals. So how do we choose these training goals? And before I start on this section, these next few slides, I wanted to mention that everything on this slide and the next slide relate to the codes at the bottom of the slide. So the BHCOE 3.0 collaboration, it's a whole list of different ways to collaborate. And there were several that fell into this, so they were kind of too long to indicate. But if you look at that part of their code, this is where this information would fit. And then for the BACB 4.02 planning and consent, it comes in here. There's also other aspects of the BACB code that apply to the next few slides, but planning and consent is the biggest one. And I think a lot of the times, especially if you work in a clinic, 4.02 planning and consent doesn't get implemented as well as it should. Sometimes we just kind of start providing services and don't really take the time to sit down with the family and go over these types of things. So for the next few slides, these are the codes that would apply and help you ensure that you're meeting those expectations. So the first one is during scheduled parent training sessions, the family and the supervisor discuss parental concerns and skills that would benefit from parent training. During this meeting, we try to make sure that the family is mostly the one providing the inputs on their concerns and the skills that they would like to see addressed. It's not a time for the behavior analyst to chime in and try to tell the parent what needs to happen. It's more to gather information from the family. And we try to do this type of meeting at least once a month, but sometimes it kind of happens a little bit less often than we would like. So this is one that what tends to happen if it doesn't happen often enough is things will start to drift and then you have to kind of reset. So this is really an important part of the process, making sure we all have our intake process where we sit down and get that initial information from the family, but goals and priorities and values shift over time. So it's important to check in as frequently as possible to find out what the parent concerns are and the skills that they would like to see addressed. sometimes families won't really have that much to say. They're looking at us as the experts, and then we'll chime in a little bit more objectively, of course, just saying, based on the results of our different assessments and our observations, these are the things that are probably the most concerning right now and the skills that would benefit from parent training. But we don't just start with that. We infuse that after the family has given their information, and if there's anything that we need to share, subsequent to that. The second one is that the supervisor and the family work together to prioritize concerns and choose a goal or goals to focus on. So during this process, the family provides input regarding which goals are most important to them at the time, and the supervisor provides feedback regarding whether or not other goals may need to be addressed first in order to obtain the goals that are important to the family. So sometimes we will have a family that says a certain goal is important to them, such as the child learning to read. And we recognize the importance of the goal and that the family values that goal. And then typically I like to try to lay it down on paper for them so they have a visual of it, but I'll write it out for them and say, so here's reading, and then kind of the different building blocks that are needed to get to reading. Say this particular child doesn't sit for instruction yet. So that might be the very first thing, is that we need to develop that instructional control and a really positive working relationship first. And then, we might get into some other things like scanning and attending, letters, letter sounds, and really show kind of how we build up to reading. We also might take that time to talk about other skills that, based on the child's age, may be something that we need to look at as well. So say the child is 7 or 8 years old and isn't toilet trained yet, but the family's big value is reading. So we might have to have a gentle discussion about that. It might be more helpful for the child's overall independence if we first focus on toilet training. That way the reading skills will be more beneficial as they go out into the environment on their own. And it will be difficult for them to go out into environments by themselves, or with as independent abilities as possible, if there's no toilet training to speak of and they're relying on people to change their diapers into adulthood. So we will have those conversations as well, but we do it as gently and objectively as possible, not forcing our values onto the family, but really just trying to have that back and forth conversation with them. If a family were to insist that, a certain goal was really their priority and they didn't really care about another goal, as long as they're not prerequisites to one another, then we focus on what the family is wanting to focus on. That's our job as the BCBA. We're there to help the family and develop intervention for the child based on the family and their values. And of course, if there's anything that, could potentially bring up some sort of like dangerous situation or something like that, we'd obviously bring that up as well and advocate for the client. But overall, the big picture is we're working for the family there. So I've seen a few things come through on the chat. I'll look at those as I finish the choosing parent training goals. So I'm going to talk about these next 3 points, and then I'll see what questions people might have had.
Megan,
So
nothing related to parent training. It's just people wanting links and stuff.
Logistics. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I'll interrupt if there's something pertinent to what you're talking about.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so number 3, once we've chosen the goals, and I didn't mention this on the previous slide, but typically what we found when choosing parent training goals, and there's no research that I've seen on this yet, but this is just based on my own experience as a practitioner, we typically try to focus on just 1, maybe up to 3 goals at a time for the parent training process. Because if we do too much, then it's just overwhelming and nothing gets done. So we really try to narrow in on what's, most beneficial right now and where can we focus our energy. So once the goals are chosen, the supervisor presents options to the family regarding how to meet those goals. The supervisor may ask the family questions about what is feasible and acceptable for them. If there are differences in input regarding how to address the goals, the supervisor presents to the family the different options and the benefits or disadvantages of those options. So in a few more slides, I'll show you our parent choice document, and that whole discussion is what the parent choice document covers. So it's not enough to just identify what the goals are, but now we have to figure out what's a feasible way to get to those goals and what would work for that family and the lifestyle that they're living. I could develop the best behavior plan ever, but if it's something only somebody could do if they're working one-on-one with the child and that's their only focus, forget it. That's not probably going to work very well, and it might cause more harm than good. So we have to really make sure that what we come up with is, right for the environment that the child will be learning the skill in. Number 4, the family and the supervisor determine which option to implement using that choice document that I'll show you. And they document the choice occurring. So we have the family, fill in that this is what they want, and they sign off on it. We've also found over time, it's really helpful that everything we do relating to intervention, especially parent training, we're documenting it and getting signatures. This is helpful because it sets up an agreement between everyone on the team and helps in terms of clarity. So we've had some situations where out of, our drive to just get an intervention in place quickly, we take vocal approval, and we may have a, signature. Obviously we have a signature approving intervention, but in terms of that specific, step that we're about to take, we didn't have a signature. And then a month or 2 later, we have an issue come up where a family may say, this isn't what I thought we were doing. I'm not happy with this. I wanted something else. And if we don't have anything in writing or anything to refer back to, it's hard to say, well, this is what we talked about and we all agreed to. And sometimes we've even had where that has happened and we look back at, the notes or whatever, and we find that actually the BCBA did drift a little bit. So this just helps keep everyone on the same page and make sure that you're implementing a plan that everyone has agreed to and understands clearly. So once an option is chosen, the supervisor writes the plan and prepares a training session for the family based on this option. And again, with the plan being written, the family has given their input and seen kind of a bullet pointed outline of the plan, but we would still discuss that plan during our training session and make sure everything's feasible and get signatures again, saying that they're good to have the plan implemented with their family. So before I move on, does anyone have questions about choosing parent training goals? Always the fun, awkward silence of a webinar. All right, I don't see any flashy things, so I'm gonna go to the next one. So when we do our initial training on a goal, we also put steps into place for that. Again, this is something we didn't initially have laid out in our policies and procedures, but we were finding people were doing it differently. So we had to make sure we had some sort of structure in place, both for our employees so we could keep fidelity there, but also for the families to understand what to expect with their parent training process. And we've also found that informing the families ahead of time is helpful, again, for that expectation piece, but it's also helpful because if for some reason it's not happening, so if an employee for whatever reason isn't following our expectations relating to parent training, the parents are informed of what it should look like. And when we check in to get feedback from the families about their services, they're more likely to be able to bring that up and ask us about it or come to us before we check in, so that we can really ensure consistency and fidelity of these interventions. So Sarah, was there a question?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we're good.
So the codes that apply to these next few slides, there were several more for these with the initial training. So for BHCOE, there's 2.0 treatment planning and 3.0 collaboration. Again, both of these codes have smaller points underneath them that would apply, but it was just too much to write for one slide. So if you implement these steps as described on the next few slides, you would be adhering to the codes in those sections for BHCOE. For the BACB, the planning and consent comes in again because you'll see we're getting a lot of feedback and all of that kind of stuff from the family. 2.09 effective treatment comes in because we require behavioral skills training, and behavioral skills training is currently the most research-based method for providing training to individuals on skills. And then 1.01 reliance on scientific knowledge, again, that comes in because we're using behavioral skills training. So for each goal, the family receives hands-on training to learn how to implement procedures related to meeting that goal. And then our hands-on training consists of explanation of the plan developed for the goal. Feedback is sought from the family at this time to confirm the plan is feasible. If the plan is not feasible, changes are made as long as the program will still be effective. Then we model the plan, we role play and practice following the plan developed for the goal. We have feedback provided using a checklist feedback form to increase successful implementation of the plan, and then the opportunity to ask questions and receive clarification. So all of this is part of the training process for whatever goal we're working on. And I'm often shocked by the number of people I talk to, whether it's at conferences or people I'm supervising or mentoring, who don't incorporate behavioral skills training with families. There's a lot of frustration that comes up both for the behavior analyst, but also for the family, when we just expect if we give them a written plan, they'll implement it. I don't really get the logic there. I don't really know why, as behavior analysts, knowing what we know about behavior change, we would think just writing something down would be sufficient to change behavior. So I've had families that we've worked with where even doing this and coming up with the simplest plan possible, a 3 or 4 step plan to work on to implement for behavior intervention is, struggle. It's a struggle for them, but we've put it to the bare bones. And this is the only, we're at the point where we either do nothing or we try these, really easy 3 or 4 steps, and the family's still struggling to implement that. And we've had to break it down even further, where we'll say, okay, all 3 of these steps aren't happening at once. So now we're just going to work on that first step. I need you to stand up when the child enters the room, because it's a preventative method to make sure the child doesn't aggress towards them. And not only do we work on that in a role playing and modeling situation during a parent training session, but I then give that to the behavior technician to practice when we're not there. So everybody understands the family is working on standing up whenever the child enters the room, and I have them take data on it. They'll do, some trial by trial data collection, and just randomly throughout the session walk into a room where the parent is and see if that parent stands up, and give the parent feedback and coaching right in the moment. And then we can finally move on and keep adding more and more steps of the plan into place. So the idea that families will just magically start implementing the plans that we're trying to give them is just kind of funny to me. So sometimes we don't have to go into that depth. I do have a few families where I can just give them a written plan and we talk about it. We do a little bit of the modeling and role play, and then they're good to go. But sometimes, the rat is always right. The parent is always right. The individual we're working with is always right. So whatever we're doing, we need to make sure we're looking at the environmental variables, and that we've provided all of the possible training and feedback and coaching that we possibly could, and that we've broken it down to that smallest level. So if you've, written a 20-step behavior plan, and even with behavioral skills training, there are lots of steps not being followed, it might mean that you have to zoom in and focus on certain areas first and build those up to fluency before you can get the full plan into place. So just those types of things are really important to keep in mind. Yes,
we have
Sarah.
a couple questions coming through. So
Sure.
The first one is, do you typically have your parent training meetings occurring at the home or in the center? And I just want to caveat by saying a lot of the providers provide services in both of those locations. So what do you suggest in terms of the best location to provide that? And then another question after that, but go for the location first.
Sure. So we only provide in-home services right now. So ours are all in the home. We have had a few situations where we'll have families come to our office space if, for example, we want to do some training without other children around and things like that, and the child care is happening at the house. But generally speaking, we're doing it in the home. And the times where we're going over the plan and doing the modeling and role playing and all of that, where the child doesn't need to be present, we typically try to do that during a session. So a lot of our insurance funding sources allow for the technician to be doing their one-on-one therapy, and parent training is something separate from that. So we can have both, or we'll have it like while the child is at school, we set up the parent training like for the hour before the child gets home from school, and then they're home and we can start practicing right away after we've done all the paperwork side of things. We try not to do it as much as possible with the child sitting right there, because we don't want to be talking about the child in front of the child. And if anything, negative, I'm using air quotes, but if there were any like kind of difficult things to talk about, we don't want the child to be present for that and have to listen and hear those types of things. So we try to do as much as we can without the child present. I have helped mentor and supervise in center-based services, and typically with that And I know this is kind of separate, but the Early Start Denver model is doing some work right now. Well, the Mind Institute at UCLA on this same idea with parent training and coaching. And then at Florida State, there's doing some research as well. I'm sure other places are, but these are just the places I'm aware of, where the families come into an office and a center, they get their parent training using similar methods as this, and then they go home and they have homework and they practice it, and then they come back a week later and they do this, kind of back and forth. And the children aren't even receiving intervention from interventionists. It's just the parents being trained and they're showing positive outcomes from that. So really, it's more of just kind of figuring out the initial logistics of it. But I don't think the environment matters initially if you are in a center and you do it at the center versus home and you do it at home. But you may find as you're doing the parent training, if there are barriers occurring, that those need to be addressed, and then, have that conversation, whether it means figuring out a way to set up time in the home if you've been doing it at a center or vice versa.
And personally, I really like to separate it out independent of where you're providing the therapy, of having in-session goals and out-of-session goals. So what do you want that parent to master while you're present? And then what do you want them to work on while you're not there? And that's how I usually separate it. So the other question that I have in the chat is about data collection. So we all know that for parents, we have to collect data, and we have to make sure that just like a child's program, we want to make sure the parent is making progress as well. But some of the questions I'm seeing are relating to like technicians or RBTs taking data and giving feedback to parents, and how do you balance that? So I know in my day and age of ABA practice, when I was a technician, I was absolutely taking data and doing a lot of the parent training. But in this day and age, because the RBT requirements tend to be a little light, how do you balance some of that training, those training issues you might run into?
So that's a great question. I actually have a few slides, or at least one slide on data collection. Is it okay if we touch on that when we get to that slide?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Were there any other questions?
I see one more that I'm not sure if I'm grasping completely, but one of them is that when you're doing the intake assessment and you develop parent goals, if you do a parent team meeting to check on progress and there are new goals, I think the question is, the best practice would be to send an addendum if there's a change in the goals. And then would you send the addendum to the funding source? I think I got the question correctly.
Okay. So this is probably not going to be the answer you want to hear, but I am not the best person to ask that question to. I don't really do a whole lot with insurance anymore. I mostly do private pay and remote supervision and mentorship. And each insurance company really has their own requirements. So you would have to look at the contract with the insurance company and see. Some insurance companies say they, document it, but they don't want to see it until the next update. Some say you can't implement anything until you've gotten it approved. So it's really one of those situations where you need to look and see what the insurance company is requiring or whatever other funding source you're using. We tend to write our plans with parent training, at least focused broader. So the goal is, more about just parent participation in the training. And that gives us a lot more room to provide various goals in the, kind of sub goal category. So that's probably a webinar topic that Sarah, you all could do a couple on. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully BHCOE can set one up that's touch more broadly about insurance treatment planning.
Yeah, that would have been my response too, is it's funder specific. Thank you, Megan.
Okay. So once we've done the initial training, we also have bullet points for follow-up training, so everybody knows what to expect from there. So once that initial training has been received for a goal, the supervisor conducts follow-up training as needed. So follow-up training consists of observing implementation of the plan and providing feedback using a checklist feedback form to increase successful implementation of the plan, collecting data on the child's performance, checking in with the family to see if there are any questions about the plan or progress being made, and making modifications to the plan as indicated by the child's progress. The frequency of the follow-up training would depend on the complexity of the goal being addressed. So with some families, we may put an initial training in place and we just follow up before we start a new goal, and we just make sure everything's still progressing the way that it was during the initial training. With some, if there's a really intensive challenging behavior or a skill deficit that's been really hard to overcome, we might be doing follow-up training every week until we really see that the goal is making good progress and being mastered. So it really depends on what we're teaching and the complexity of that goal being addressed. Okay, so now documentation and data collection. So the last part of our parent procedures that we have that I wanted to go over today is relating to the documentation and data collection. And these surprisingly, these bullet points were added once we became required by the insurance companies to provide specific data on parent training. So we had always required parent training to occur, and we were always taking our own data and notes and things like that. But once the insurance companies started requiring parent training as well, there were kind of more requirements in place regarding what they were wanting, and families started to become a little bit hesitant. Why are you taking data on me? Isn't it my child that you're serving? And that kind of thing. And all the families were aware that this was something being required by the insurance companies, and it was making them very nervous. So this was mostly put into place to help the families know why we were collecting data, what it should look like, what it was being used for. Obviously, when we were doing it before, they knew we were collecting data, but it wasn't getting sent anywhere. So they weren't as apprehensive about it until they found out like the funding source was going to be looking at, parent training and progress there. So we put these into place based on that. And then also, though, we were having a little bit of inconsistency with our employees, kind of having different ideas of what parent training data collection should look like. So most often it was basically requiring the families to do too much and maybe like run a session with the child. And that, we needed to clear up was not what we were trying to have happen. Now, occasionally we might have families that choose and ask to be trained on how to do sessions because they want more time for their child outside of what their child's receiving with our interventionist. But generally speaking, that is not an expectation of our families. We want to train them on natural environment practices that they can, just become part of their everyday life, so they can just live and be a family, not sit down and do, one-on-one sessions with their child. So this is what we have written for the families. The same codes apply for this section as the previous one. So BHCOE 2.0 treatment planning and programming and 3.0 collaboration. And then for the BACB effective treatment and 1.01 reliance on scientific knowledge, because we're collecting data. So to adhere to our ethical guidelines and funding source requirements, documentation of parent training is required. So the first bullet point is that families receive documentation related to choosing parent training goals, choosing plans to address the goals, and the final plans developed for addressing the goals. This documentation requires parent signatures to confirm the training occurred. This we wrote in there mostly for the parents to help them understand that process again, but also why we were asking for their signatures, because some families were also apprehensive about signing that they were receiving parent training. So we just wanted them to know, why we were doing what we were doing. This is our bullet point about data collection. So there's kind of a lot of information on here, but I wanted it all on one slide so you could see some of the different ways that we're collecting data. So we give this to the families so that they understand, but we also give it to our employees. Data collection for parent training goals may occur in the following ways. A, collecting data on parent participation during parent training activities. So with this, we're really just recording whether or not the parent participated in a parent training activity. It's really just a checkbox, yes, we did parent training this week, or no, we didn't. It's very basic, and usually with most families, we at least have this in place. And sometimes we'll find that families are really hesitant to do anything more than that. So we can, kind of work on shaping that and building trust before we put into place any more intensive data collection. B, collecting data using the checklist feedback form. This consists of providing feedback to the family regarding implementation of the plan. This form can be used to identify areas that require additional training and to determine if a plan needs to be adjusted. For B, we've had to give a lot of sort of explanation to families. Typically, we use that checklist feedback form. We always use it during our behavioral skills training and that initial practice. Whether or not we do check-ins with it will depend on our relationship with the family. Ideally, we would be doing it every single time, but if it's going to disrupt our relationship with the family and make them think we're grading them and judging them, then we hold off. And again, it's a shaping process. So the checklist, though, we try to make really clear. This is not a grade. This is not to say you're good, you're bad, or anything like that. It's just to help me as the behavior analyst, determine if additional training needs to be done on certain steps. It's my job. I have, not done my job completely if these steps aren't being implemented. So it helps me know how I can help you. And then again, I can't adjust the plan if I don't know which steps are being implemented and which ones aren't. So it helps in that sense as well. It has nothing to do with you, parents, that I'm taking this data on. I know it seems like it does, but really it's to help ensure that your child is, receiving the plan that we developed and figure out to make sure that we've done everything we can to support you all. So we try to, really make that clear with the families. C, collecting ongoing data on the child's performance. So this usually consists of the parent collecting data on a daily basis in order to track the child's progress with the goal. This data collection is necessary when the data are needed in order to provide effective services. So we have that little bullet point in there because, again, like I said, sometimes this was being over applied and our behavior analysts were requiring families to take ridiculous amounts of data or expecting them to throughout the day. And then we came to find out, like, really, we could just do a data sample, like I'm going to talk about in D. And the families were getting really overwhelmed and not real supportive of this whole parent training thing. So we had to, say, this might be something you'll be expected to do, but only if it's absolutely necessary for us to provide effective services. And even when we do daily data collection, it might just be a calendar on the fridge and they put a check mark or an X. Did the behavior occur that day or not? Again, we look at where the family is performing and we figure out what, their needs are, and we base our data collection off of that. I need just enough data to be able to monitor this plan and make changes, but I'm not going to give you things that you can't do, and then the data might not happen, or it might be created at the last minute anyway. So we are really aware of what's realistic for the family if we do need some type of daily data collection. And then D is collecting data samples of the child's performance. So with this, it would consist of the BCBA collecting data on a weekly, bi-weekly, or even monthly basis to track the child's progress with the goal. So we've had situations where, say we're working on like brushing teeth or something like that. So we may do the training on it, show them what to do. And then the next month when parent training happens, we say, okay, show me the, toothbrushing, let's see how things are going. We get down our data on that. And then we decide, if it's mastered, great, we move on to something else. If it's not, we figure out what's going on and we tweak it. Now, obviously we explain to the families, the less frequent we have to check in on this, the slower the progress could be if things aren't going well. And we have that discussion, but we have to balance what's realistic with what, with what's not, basically. So what's realistic and what will be effective. And as long as we're able to get some measure of progress, sometimes that's the, the reality with the parent training situation. We'd rather be realistic and get the accurate data that we need than be too far out there and we get zero data at all or fake data. This data collection is necessary in order to provide effective services and typically occurs by having the supervisor observe the family, implement the plan, and collect data on the child's performance during this time. So that's our general data collection. Now, again, there's a whole slew of different ways we could collect data, but these are kind of the 4 categories that we've found were generally kind of incorporating with our families. Now, the RBT question that came up earlier, Sarah, I don't have anything specific to the RBTs in here. We are slightly limited in Virginia as well because where navigation is based, we have licensure, and the RBTs are very much restricted on what activities they're allowed to do. So all of our things in Virginia require the families to receive most of their training and feedback from the BCBA. If it's under our delegation and we are not expecting the RBT to provide training, and we're not expecting them to do anything that a BCBA would do, but it's more of just like a check-in / reminder, and it's part of the intervention plan. So we have it in there on paper and everybody's agreed to it. Then we may use the RBTs to just, say, hey, what's the data? And like, I'm going to, scan it and send it to the BCBA, just like they would with their session data. So things like that, or they may, have a form that they fill out where they interview the parents, just like we're allowed to do with assisting with assessment and intervention. So they might have a form they fill out and they interview the parents and then send that over to the BCBA. So we never have the RBTs do any sort of like initial training or feedback or anything like that. Now, like I said, I work kind of everywhere. So I'm a little bit more, I have a little bit more flexibility in other states or different areas, especially when it might not necessarily be an RBT. It's just a behavior interventionist, a line therapist that's been hired by the family, and they're there with the child for hours upon hours each day. And that's where I get a little bit more flexible with being able to say, okay, you're going to practice this. You know, I'm not physically there. I live across the world. So here, and I'll write out a very specific scripted plan for them. The family approves, and then we practice whatever needs to be practiced, and we discuss it and then update and all of that kind of stuff. So how the kind of the line therapists are used really depends on A, licensure laws, B, if they're an RBT, making sure we're adhering to that, C, their competencies, and you know, how much I'm physically able to be there with the family. In our services that we provide in Virginia, the BCBAs are, depending on the case, but generally speaking, are at the client's house weekly or biweekly. So we don't have any issues like that there. They are there frequently enough to be the ones doing all of the parent training process. Does that answer that question?
I'll wait for the chat to respond to see whether that answered it. But in the meantime, there was a question that came in about the Ruby curriculum. And the question was whether the Ruby curriculum adheres to the BHCOE guidelines for parent training. And my response in the chat that I wanted to share with everyone was just that the curriculum is just a teaching tool of what to teach. But what Megan's really talking about here is the ways in which to teach and how to document the success of teaching. So you can absolutely use a curriculum, and in this case, the Ruby curriculum is a great parent training curriculum. But it's important to note that all of this kind of relates to whether you're using that curriculum or not. How are we creating those goals, right? Curriculum, but then how are we measuring progress? How are we communicating that with our parents and all those other pieces?
Perfect.
And I did get confirmation that you answered the question about the RBT. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, and we like Ruby a lot as well. We use it. It is, for those of you that don't know, it is researched. It came out of Ohio State University, and they're not even BCBAs, but some of the autism developmental people that work in that area there, and they did research it extensively before publishing it. Okay, so some training supports and resources. We don't have a ton of time left, but I just wanted to go over these with you. And I do have a Google Drive link, Sarah, that I could share with you if you want to send this out after.
Absolutely.
So for behavioral skills training, again, we say that this should be done each time a family is receiving formal training on an intervention or protocol. So when we're initially training a specific goal, we use this. The preference is for a written packet for the family because that's easier to follow along with, but sometimes, you know, time constraints and things like that, it doesn't happen. We create this after collaborating with the family about the intervention because we don't want the families to, you know, change their mind or something like that. So we have to make sure that they're on board with the basic outline of the intervention before we spend our time writing up a training packet for that. So I'm going to screen share the sample BST packet real quick. So this is the sample packet. I'm not going to read through all of it right now. Some of you may have already seen this if you've attended any of the other webinar events that I've done, but this is just an example packet. So we have at the very top is the rationale, the purpose for the intervention. Then we have our procedure. So these are the instructions and the description. Now you'll see this is very lengthy and detailed steps, but what we did was in bold, we put kind of the shorter things to remember so that people, you know, when you're looking at BST, you try to keep your steps really short and not too deep, not with too many words. So so we try to keep these the bolded parts are what we're really focusing on when we're training the family. And then what we do is we have even just built in within the training packet, we have our checklist and we have it. So this one is our role play. So we'll say, okay, now we're going to role play this, and I'll model it first, and then then we'll switch. So this is apparently one that I need to edit. I thought it was edited, but it's not. Some of my X's got all over the place. So with this though, we have our checklist. These are the steps of the program, and then we say yes, no, NA. And then down at the bottom, we identify like one or two things. Now, I created this packet years ago. One of the things that I've sort of modified since then is this part where it says that you did really well and things to work on. We might change this to say like glows and grows, using just different words to kind of frame it better as like, this isn't, this isn't something that you're not doing well, but more like, these are the things we just need to, you know, keep in mind as we're implementing this. Then we have the section, it's the same exact checklist again, but now they're going to do this with the child. So this is our rehearsal practice, and we give feedback. And we would do this part until we're seeing the steps being implemented with consistency, where we're coaching and giving them feedback with the child. And then that's pretty much the end of the packet. So this checklist is what I was talking about before, where I was saying we have these checklists for feedback. Okay, so I'm not going to keep flipping back and forth to the PowerPoint. I'm just going to go ahead and show you all the other resources that we have created, and then I'll go through the PowerPoint slides right there at the end. So this is that choice document that I was telling you about. So the purpose of this document is to outline the general steps for determining parent training. So all of those things that we talked about on the first few slides are kind of infused in here, but we have some other things as well. So like if you look at number 4, it says, go over the options with the family. When explaining the options, do not use subjective or judgmental discourse, just present the options in an objective way. You should be open and honest about the advantages and disadvantages of the plans for the family and for the child. So we're giving our employees, you know, directions on how to properly use this document. This is the table template. So what we do is we have our plans. We usually just number them or letter them, or we might give like one word things, but we try not to say like best, better, worse, or anything like that. It's just supposed to be an objective thing. So usually though, at the very top of the table, we'll list the optimal plan. So whatever the optimal plan would be that would have the best outcomes for the child, we bullet point that there. And then we describe our expected outcomes. Then number 2 is what would be a likely effective option, but we have some of the steps are less than the optimal plan. And we base the steps on ones that the family doesn't really seem to value or like they wouldn't want to implement. And then we describe our projected outcomes. And then the third one is basically the status quo, and we describe the projected outcomes there as well. After we kind of explain this with the family, we have them read through this paragraph, initial, or it's give the, you know, what dates we're going to implement the plan, and then everybody signs and initials, or signs and dates it. So at the next page, I have an example for you all of what I was talking about with these projected outcomes and plan guidelines. So you can see we just have some bullet points here of the plan and then what the projected outcomes would be. And you can see that if you read through this, once you get the link, the plan for number 2 is almost identical to number 1, but with just a little bit of modification to make it a little bit easier to implement. And then number 3 is that status quo. And we typically will put in the third one that the status quo, if it's a really intensive behavior, we'll put the option is not recommended by NBC, just to make it clear on paper that we're saying, you know, some type of intervention is needed. So we would recommend not doing this one, choose from 1 or 2, but we don't, you know, have to keep it. If it was something more like skills based or, you know, not dangerous to the child, we probably wouldn't put that bullet point there. And then we have a second example in here as well. So you all can look through that and then email me if you have any questions. Down here at the bottom, we kind of change like the signature names and things like that, just depending on the family and who we're working with. All right, and then the last one, this is the parent training session checklist that we use. So when we conduct parent training, the formal parent training with our families, we have this document that our clinicians can use. So they put the client initials, the dates, who the provider is, the start and the end time. And then they indicate whether or not current goals are selected and in progress, yes or no. If there's any parent concerns, and then if there were no current goals, what goals are being added. And then we have the family indicate and the provider whether or not BST was used, what kind of data collection is being used, whether the data was collected with fidelity, if there are performance or skill deficits, and then a little bit about the data analysis, like the current data shows that, you know, the child's making progress, etc. And then down at the bottom here is our notes where we expect a summary to be given about the parent training session. So just like, you know, your narrative data you would have, we opened up discussing our goals, blah, blah, blah. Parents' new concerns were da, da, da. And decisions were made relating to, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then we have everyone sign at the bottom. We found that this note section is really important in terms of being able to go back and look at if a family or a provider kind of disagree on what was discussed in a parent training session. Having these notes is really helpful. Just keeping them objective and just like, you know, quick summary of like from beginning to end what you did in that session and agreed upon is really helpful.
Megan, one question that's coming through
Yep.
is what if parents are unavailable for parent training? Do you still work with the child? For example, a single parent who works few jobs. And I have one comment just from a compliance perspective, and then Megan can talk about it from a clinical perspective. The first takeaway that I would say is just to document lack of parent involvement. So you absolutely want parents to be involved, but there's certainly case situations where they may not be. And you just want to make sure you're documenting it appropriately, because it's essentially like covering your back a little bit that you're maybe not engaging in the best clinical practice, but not because you don't want to, maybe because there's some external circumstances in place. And then Megan, I don't know if you want to jump in about, you know, do you continue working with them, or how you kind of determine that as well?
Yep. So what we typically do is because we provide in-home services. So we always require that someone is at the home other than the child. We're not babysitters. We're there providing medically necessary intervention. So that could be a respite care worker. It could be a grandma, a grandpa, just any adults age 18 or over. Sometimes we'll make exceptions to the age depending on circumstances, but someone has to be there. So if the parent doesn't participate, then we document that, as Sarah said, but we will train whatever other caregiver is there. And so we at least have some sort of training going on. But what we typically do, even for families where it's a single parent or things like that, our providers, it's not like a 9-to-5 type job. So they make their own schedules and they work with the families to schedule in that time to meet with them. So even if on a more regular basis they're training that caregiver, they'll still set up at least once every few months time with the family. And that's another thing I mentioned briefly earlier, scheduled parent training sessions. This is something we schedule with the families. It's not just something where they like pop in and say, hey, let's do some parent training today. It's a scheduled part of our service delivery so that everybody's, you know, there and ready for the training to occur.
One other question is about how do you deal with the larger family unit? So do you do multiple trainings for grandparents, aunts, and uncles, or do you kind of teach the parent and hope the message gets disseminated?
It really depends on the situation. So sometimes we've done larger trainings. Sometimes we train the parent and hope that they disseminate. It just depends on the family and what works best for them. Sometimes the parent doesn't, you know, they want to be the ones disseminating that. And that would be our ideal, is kind of a train the trainer type thing where they're so competent with it that they can teach others in their life about what they're doing. But it just really depends on the situation. The ultimate goal always being what's best for this child and what do we need to do to make this work.
And one other question is, what about parents that want ABA but not after the provider leaves the home, so they don't want to implement it at all?
Then we don't provide services to them, basically. So, let's be honest. We can't be effective in what we're doing. And there are and what is the number now? 1 in 36, 50, depending on what you're looking at, children diagnosed with autism. There are not enough of us out there. We will serve the families that are ready for this, for their lives, not just, you know, drop them off, get 2 hours of intervention and leave. So that's how we do it. Now, again, there are unique circumstances and we will be flexible depending on the situation. But generally speaking, those families go somewhere else. We're not going to provide services if they can't be an active part of the intervention. And we lay that out from the beginning with our policies and procedures.
And Megan, it looks like we're just running up on the hour. So I want to thank you so much. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts before we let our folks go and continue to take on their day. But this has been very informative for me, at least, and hopefully for everyone listening as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I did have 2 slides that I didn't talk about. We're not going to have time, but if people, you know, if they get the PowerPoint and they want to review them, feel free to send me questions. But my closing thoughts, we train our clinicians and families on the policies, procedures, and expectations. And at least once a year, but usually more often than that, we review these, at least with the clinicians, and then we might have them review with the families as well. Make sure you're providing rationales both to your clinicians, but also to your families about why you're doing what you're doing, so they don't think you're just trying to like check things off of a box. Shaping is really important. Start with where your families are and build from there. So the ultimate goal might be like 2 hours of really active parent training with tons of data collection. But if they're struggling just to keep their head above water, you might just be building a relationship at first and kind of checking in on things, and that's fine. Flexibility is key. There's not one way for each family to do things. You need to kind of learn as much as you can about effective coaching and training procedures, and then develop that for your family. Don't take things personally. Please don't take things personally. Families are dealing with so much, and I can't tell you how many times I've had people think that a family, you know, is being mean to them or hates them or whatever, but really it's the life they're living. Now, we require professional interactions, but if a parent's having a rough day, just keep that in mind. And then, like I said before, the parent is always right. So if you're not making progress with parent training and the parents aren't on board and not implementing what they should be, reflect on you and what you're doing as the service provider to fix that, because it's not the parent's fault. And that is all. This is my contact information. Sorry about the dog barking. If you all can hear that, I work from home and it's just barking a lot today. So sorry about that.
Wonderful. And for everyone asking in the chat, all of the slides and the Dropbox link that Megan mentioned will be sent to all attendees who've registered, or all registrants as well. So keep an eye out for that email. We've really streamlined our CEU process now, so you should be getting those very soon. So thank you all for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again, Megan.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.